Good afternoon. Welcome to this afternoon's webinar on Azure AD External Identities New Features. My name is Peter Carson. I'm going to be presenting for the next hour for you or so. This is actually a new topic for me, so I'm not sure exactly how the timing is going to work out, but we'll keep it within the hour for sure. For those of you who haven't attended one of my webinars before, I'm the president of Extranet User Manager, also in Vision IT. We should probably add that in there, and an Office Apps and Services Microsoft MVP for the last 10, 11 years now. Contact information is up here. We're going to share the deck and the recording up on our event page, so everyone will get a follow-on email letting you know when that's available to download from there. So by all means, feel free to reach out. We also have the Q&A open in the Teams live events. If you've got questions as they're going through, we've got Eric and Logan on the line as well. They'll do their best to answer questions. I may not get a chance to look as we're going through, but I'll try and take a minute at the end just to catch up on anything from that point of view. A little background if you're not familiar with Extranet User Manager. Today's session is not on our product, but as you can see, we've been working in the Extranet space for a lot of years here, working with Microsoft 365 and B2B for quite a few years as well. And today we're going to sort of cover off what Azure AD B2B is, and then what are some of the cool new features that Microsoft's released over the last year or so. So we got clients all around the world. We'll skip through those and just jump right into the agenda. And I am going to drop my camera off here now, just so you've got a better view of the screen as we go through. So as I mentioned, we're going to start with a quick background level set from an Azure AD B2B business to business background. We'll talk about some changes from a licensing perspective that Microsoft has done. Microsoft never makes the licensing easy, but they've actually made it easier, I think, in this scenario. We'll dive into that. And then we'll get into some of the new features, specifically self-service sign-up, the ability for people to self-register as guests in your tenant, a terms of use feature to accept terms of use as part of logging into your tenant, and entitlement management, which is an Azure AD Premium Plan 2 feature that we can use with the self-service sign-ups. We're going to go through a number of scenarios and demos as we do that. As always, Q&A throughout, and I'll try and take a quick look at that at the end as well. Okay, so let's start with external identity solutions. So there's actually two separate products from Microsoft, Azure AD B2B and B2C. And I'm not actually sure if they're that keen on the names. I know some of the folks in Redmond necessarily weren't. They're not necessarily directly targeted to either business or to consumers, as the name would indicate. It's really more about whether they're coming into your Azure AD tenant, which is the B2B scenario, or whether they're coming into their own standalone tenant from in their language, a consumer-facing apps. But it doesn't have to be consumer-facing. It's really a completely separate identity access management solution for your own SaaS and custom apps. We're going to focus on the B2B side. So that's the scenario where you're bringing the guests into your own Azure AD tenant. And under the hood, if you do sharing in Microsoft 365, let's say you use Teams or SharePoint or OneDrive and you share links out, that's actually using B2B under the hood. So it's a great way to collaborate with your suppliers, your partners, your vendors, lots of different scenarios from that point of view. And at the end of the day, you actually see those users as guest users in your directory. So what does that mean from a Microsoft 365 point of view? What it means is that basically external users can access anything in Microsoft 365, but also any other system that's single sign-on exposed through Azure Active Directory. Now, for certain Microsoft 365 workloads, not all of them, it is completely free. So if you bring users into SharePoint, Teams, Planner, even the Office Online apps, if they want to use Word, Excel, PowerPoint in the online version, it's free for all your external users. You could literally have a Microsoft 365 subscription with one paid user in it and 1 million external people, and that's totally cool from a Microsoft licensing point of view. The caveat is that they do need to be external users, and we'll talk more about that in a second. Now, it's not carte blanche, though. It doesn't cover all of Microsoft 365. Some of the things that we specifically run into, there's probably more in there where you do have to have external licensing. Power BI is one that often causes us a challenge. If we're publishing dashboards through Power BI, the users that are coming in, if we're using per user license, need their own license. They can actually use their license from their tenant if they're using Power BI themselves in their own Microsoft 365, that'll work. Or you can actually apply a license to the guest user and pay for their license in your tenant. A nicer way to do it in broader extranet scenarios is to use the capacity model of Power BI, where you pay by capacity and you can bring as many internal or external users in as you want. You don't have to worry about the licensing in that. The other is Power Apps. If you're exposing Power Apps to external users, there's a portal and there's different licensing for external users on that. It gets kind of confusing. I won't get into the details there. And like I said, there's likely others as part of that. But basically, you can invite as many external users as you'd like. So it does probably important to stress what an external user is, because we do have clients occasionally that come to us and say, hey, we've got 1,000 employees that work in the office, but we've got another 3,000 that work out in the field, or they work on the shop floor and they're never in front of a computer, but they still want to come into our staff portal, for example. So can we use external licensing for that? Well, the answer, unfortunately, is no, you can't. If those folks are employees, even if they're contractors, even if they're affiliates, we went through this a number of years back with Canadian Tires. Canadian Tire is a major Canadian retailer. And there's about 3,000 people that work for Canadian Tire Retail, which is the main holding company. But there's about 50,000 staff that work in the stores. And those are franchisees that are independently owned, and they're employees of the franchise store owners. Those are considered affiliates. So the ruling after we went through Microsoft Legal was no, you can't define those as external users. They're not fully arm's length, and you have to have a license for those users. So what we encourage people to look at is things like the Microsoft 365 F1 license. It doesn't include a mailbox. It does include Teams. It does include full access into SharePoint. So if you want to have your first line workers, your shop floor workers, your outside workers have access, say, to your company staff portal, absolutely do that. You will have to pay per user for those, but it's quite cost effective. I think it's somewhere around a little less than $3 US per user for those F1 licenses. So that's something to think about there. Okay, so single sign-on with Azure Active Directory B2B. So it's not just for coming into Microsoft properties. It's not just for Microsoft 365. Azure AD is what's called an OpenID Connect identity provider. That's a technical term which basically says that you can federate with other systems, and when those systems need you to sign in, they don't do that sign in themselves. They redirect and take you over to that identity provider, which in this case would be Azure AD. It also supports OAuth 2.0, which is a subset of OpenID Connect, and SAML 2.0, which is an older standard as well. There are other standards like WS Federation that SharePoint on-premises use. Those are not supported by Azure AD B2B, but if you're bringing apps in, it could be third-party SaaS apps, it could be your own custom apps, any of those applications, as long as they can federate with one of those identity provider frameworks, then you can use Azure AD for single sign-on through there. And the beauty is once a user signs in once, as they go to other apps, they don't need to authenticate again. So imagine for a minute that you've invited a guest into your SharePoint portal, and it's maybe a vendor portal that you want to bring vendors into. Well, if those vendors use Microsoft 365 themselves, and maybe they're already in their own organization's SharePoint Online portal, and they click a link to go to yours, they don't even see a login. They just go straight in through single sign-on. They don't have to re-authenticate as part of that. So it's very seamless from that perspective. So what does that look like? How does a guest onboard in? Well, it depends what they use. So in that first scenario that I was just describing, where that guest user actually uses Microsoft 365, or maybe they don't even use 365, but they have Azure AD credentials in their organization. They use those organizational credentials. So the key with all of these is that you, as the inviting party that are bringing these guests in, you don't manage credentials for any of these folks. You manage their email address as their unique identifier for them, but their credentials are stored in their home tenant. So they would single sign on through their own 365. It also works the same way if they've got a personal Microsoft account. Now, what happens if I come in, I'm using an organizational email address, and my organization is not set up in Azure AD? In the past, there was a whole convoluted process where you would actually create an Azure AD account for your email, and you had to create a process for self-service password reset. It was high friction, and a lot of people bailed, and we had a lot of drop-off through registration. And Microsoft brought out a feature about 1.5 years ago called one-time passcode. And it's still an optional feature. We're going to talk in a minute about timing on that. I'd encourage everybody to use it. Basically, it means that when I go to sign in, whether it's my first time or my 10th time coming in, if I need to re-authenticate, you can set Microsoft 365 to not force a re-authentication every time they launch the browser. You can say, you know what, your authentication is valid for 30 days, even if you close your browser. But if they have to authenticate, they get emailed a code. It's valid for 30 minutes. They copy that code from their email, they paste it in, where they would normally put their password in, and away they go from there. And the nice thing is that not only is it very friction-free for the person that's coming in, but it also ensures that they still own that email address. So if they're working for a partner organization and they leave that organization, they no longer have access to your portal, because odds are they don't have access to their organizational email anymore if they don't work there anymore. So it's a nice way to ensure that guest users are properly cleaned up from that point of view. The guest record could still be in your tenant. We'll talk about access reviews in a minute and ways to clean that up, but it does validate that. And then the last feature, again, an optional, you don't have to turn this on, but Microsoft supports federation with both Google and Facebook. So it's similar to having a Microsoft account. Now the caveat is, if you're using Google, it does actually have to be an @gmail.com. So if they've set up a business email where it's their vanity domain, at acme.corp, and that's actually Google under the hood, Microsoft doesn't know that it's Google under the hood. So it has to actually see the @gmail.com and the email address for that to work. So we see less of that from a B2B point of view, but as I mentioned, those business to business or business to consumer names are kind of misleading. You can use business to business to bring individual consumers into your SharePoint portal if you wanted to, or into your team from that point of view. There may be scenarios you want to do that, and maybe you want to federate that with Gmail and Facebook to make that easier for the people coming in. So lots of ways you can slice and dice this. So when you want to bring users in, in the past, we're going to talk about new ways to do this, but in the past, basically you would come into the Azure portal and you would either say, hey, I want to invite a new guest user as a one of, or maybe I want to bulk invite in. I've got a whole spreadsheet of 100 or 1,000 people I want to invite. Go ahead and do that. It'll load that up and send out those invitations. And you can customize the email that goes out to the user that welcomes them in and lets them know that they've got access to something in your portal from there. Okay, so that's kind of the background on Azure AD B2B. Let's get into some of the new things. So the first is on the licensing side. So the first thing to remember is this only applies to Azure AD premium features. A lot of people think, oh, if I want to use external, there's some licensing I have to pay for external users. No, if you don't want to use premium features, it's completely free. Bring in as many external users as you want. There's no issue from that point of view. If you do want to use the premium features, though, you have to license your staff for those premium features as well. So let's say you want to use the premium P1 features. I'll talk about in the next slide what those features are. You have to license your staff for the P1 features. So there's a per user staff cost for that. And there used to be what was called this 1-to-5 billing ratio. So if I licensed 100 staff for Azure AD Premium Plan 1, I could have 500 external users also use those features. They got rid of that and they said, you know what, let's keep it really simple in this case. So kudos to Microsoft for simplifying this. Basically, your first 50,000 monthly active users. So let's say you have 100,000 users coming in every month using your external features. You got a big extranet going on. But in any case, the first half of those, the first 50,000 are completely free. If you've got more than 50,000, so let's take that example of 100,000. So we can knock off the initial 50. We say, okay, we've got 50,000 remaining. And I multiply that by 0.00416 per user per month. So it'd be another $200 a month for that for Plan 1. If you said, hey, I wanted to do 50,000 users at P2, it's going to be a little pricier, 0.02, whoops. About $1,000 a month. But still, I mean, that's 50,000 users that we're talking about. It's a pretty big number, above and beyond the 50,000 free ones that we have. Most of our clients, we never see more than 50,000 monthly active users, so you're in this free tier from that point of view. So nice job there, Microsoft. They've certainly made the licensing simpler from that point of view. So why would you want Azure AD Premium P1 or Premium P2? What are in those that are important? And I've highlighted the features that are particularly relevant to external users. And the first is around conditional access. And I actually recommend to every client, no matter how big or how small you are, even if you're a handful of employees, you should probably have Azure AD Premium P1 for all of your users. The main thing being there, conditional access and multi-factor authentication. You can turn on MFA for all users in your org, and you absolutely should. But it's better to manage it through conditional access. You get more granular control and better user experience from that point of view. In the days of cybercrime that we're in here today, not having MFA turned on is a big gotcha. In fact, we had one client didn't have it fully rolled out in their organization. Their insurance company refused to renew their cybersecurity insurance, and they had a big panic. Said, "Okay, stop everything. We got to get MFA rolled out here." And that was a wake-up call for them. But it should be a wake-up call for everybody that you need to have that in place. We're going to talk about terms of use, and to use terms of use, you have to use conditional access policies. So you have to have Azure AD Premium P1 in order to do that. So the conditional access is a big part of that. The other piece is Azure Information Protection. I'll talk a bit more about that in a sec, but the ability to apply sensitivity labels to sites and content, and then have those labels drive conditional access. So let's say you've got two portals. One is a very informational one, low security information that's in it. It's still want it to be secured, but it's not super secret. And another one, maybe you have personal health information in, super confidential. You want to make sure it's secure from that point of view. You can actually use Azure Information Protection and conditional access to say, hey, for the light security one, I'm not going to do much, but for the personal health information one that's highly secure, I'm going to make sure my guests go through multi-factor authentication as well. Generally, you don't want to turn that on for guests because it's a high friction. It's going to be a pain point from a support point of view. But if the information is that critical, then maybe you should make them go through that from that point of view. That's a decision you need to make from a risk versus security point of view. And then Azure AD Premium P2 are the things that we're going to add in here. The privileged identity management. This is something that we're rolling out with all of our clients. It allows you to say, hey, as a guest coming into your tenant, let's say we need global admin access into your tenant. Rather than having that as a carte blanche open all the time, which I actually don't want. I don't want that risk as an organization into my clients' tenants. We can set up privileged identity management and say, hey, we have to do something in your tenant. Give us access for the next 4 hours. And after 4 hours, our access is locked out. We need it extended. We can ask to extend it. It's a much safer way of managing privileged access in there. The two, though, that we're going to focus on is access reviews and entitlement management. So the ability to review users and say, hey, should they still have access? They haven't logged in 3 months. Maybe I should remove those accounts. And entitlement management, hey, how do I access or request access to a package, whether it's Teams or SharePoint or applications and such? That's what entitlement management is all about. So those are P2 features in there. So yeah, just to go a little further on Azure Information Protection, if you're not familiar with it, it's a way to classify and protect content. So it works in tandem with Azure Rights Management, so it actually encrypts the documents. So it doesn't matter what you do with that document. If somebody's allowed to download it, they could download it, they could put it on a thumb drive, they could give it to somebody else. But if that somebody else doesn't have rights in Azure Rights Management, they can't use that content. It's encrypted. You have to authenticate to Rights Management and come back to Azure Information Protection and say, hey, what am I allowed to do with this? And you can be very granular. You can say, hey, you're allowed to view the content online, but you can't download it, you can't copy it, you can't print it, you can't edit it. So, much more granular than can you see it, can you not, from that point of view. And conditional access can tie in very nicely with that to say, hey, sharing of content with certain labels, or what do I need to do with multi-factor authentication before I access that sensitive content? That's something that you can layer in as part of that. And there is a plan 1 and plan 2 on Azure Information Protection as well. Really the differentiation there is, are those labels applied manually by users, or is it using some artificial intelligence to automatically apply those labels? That's the plan 2 feature. As I said, kudos, they simplified the Azure AD P1, P2 licensing for external users, but their licensing is still fairly complicated. There's a lot of ways to bundle up AIP and Azure AD and things like that. Okay, so let's move off of the licensing and get into the actual cool stuff, the new features from an external identities point of view. So the first one is the one-time passcode. I know it's not new. It's been in general, or it's been in preview for quite some time now. The additional ways to authenticate, the Google came first, the Facebook came more recently from that point of view. But I'm going to focus on the temporary passcode approach. This idea that, hey, I don't need to remember a password. It's just emailed to me. It's valid for 30 minutes. And, if I've got an extended period that I can stay authenticated, I don't need to do that again through that period. So basically, the user goes to sign in, they get sent a one-time passcode, they get it from their email, they put it into the form, and now they have access in. So it's quite simple from that point of view. So let's actually go through a demo of that scenario. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start a brand new in private window here. And I'm actually going to use our Extranet User Manager portal product. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time today talking about our Extranet User Manager product, but basically we use one-time passcode as part of it. So let's say I'm coming in as a brand new user. I want to access some public group that we've made available for people to self-register for. And we actually have one here called no approval. I don't even need to go through an approval process. So it's kind of our fastest path through. So let's go ahead and do that. Now, before I can complete joining the group, I actually need to self-register and create an account. So I'm going to hit that join group button, and we should get a login form coming up first. This is actually not Azure AD yet. This is our own sign-in process. So I'm going to create a unique email address that I haven't used before here and say continue. One of the things we do is we look and say, hey, have I seen this email address before or not? And decide whether we take it down the login path or the registration. Here we're going down to the registration. So I have to fill in the registration fields. Okay, so I'll go ahead and do that. And what we're doing behind the scenes is we're actually registering the guests. So this isn't the self-registration for Microsoft. I'm going to show you that in a minute to compare and contrast. But let's just let this go through. And at the end of this, not only should it create an account for me, but it'll put me in an Azure Active Directory group and provide me access to a SharePoint site based on that group that I asked to join. It's taking its time here. I think this is on our side, so I can't blame Microsoft for this. We got a little tweaking in this demo environment to do. So we'll give it a few seconds more. Oh, no, I'm still having problems here. I had some problems earlier this morning. I thought we fixed them, but we'll give it a second shot and see if that goes through for me. There we go. Okay, so it's done my registration and now it wants me to sign in. So now you can see I'm on login.microsoftonline.com. I'm actually on the Microsoft side and say, yeah, I want to get a code so I can sign in. So we'll give Microsoft a second there. That usually comes through pretty quick. Just waiting for that email. Here we go. Okay, so let me pull that across. So this is the email coming from Microsoft saying, here's your one-time passcode to sign into the site. So think of this as your password, basically. It's only valid for 30 minutes. It is a one-time, so as soon as I use it, somebody else can't use it. It can't be used by multiple people through there. My system in general is just being a little slow here. There we go. So I can double click that verification code. I'll close the email. Go ahead and paste that in here and sign in. So I've now registered, and now I need to do a consent. So I'm a new user coming in from not really my tenant because I'm using a one-time passcode, but the same applies. I have to accept the consent that's saying, hey, Envision IT wants to sign you in and read your name, email address, and photo. So I'm going to go ahead and accept that. And that same consent happens on the out-of-the-box experience as well. I'll show you that later. Now we have our own disclaimer. I'm going to talk about the terms and conditions on the other side. This disclaimer only applies if you're coming through this portal product, and then I can come back here and enter the site. So where I end up at the end of this is back on that same page that I started when I said I wanted to join that group, but now I'm signed in with that new email address that I just registered, and I have access to that public group no approval. Now I think this view site's not going to work for me because I got that error as I was signing in. We'll see what happens. Oh, no, it did work properly for me. Cool. So now I have access to this SharePoint site that's being shared with that public group no approval Azure Active Directory group. In fact, we have a web part here that'll show us all the users in there. And actually, if I go back into Azure Active Directory for a minute, have a look at groups. And there's that EOM public group, no approval. That's the one we were just looking at. So if I look at the members of that group, there's my 0727-8. That's the new user that I just added in. In fact, if I go back to here, we have a web part that we show all the members of the group, make it easy for people to see what's happening in there. There's my 0727-8. And we've actually set this up so it's very easy to say, hey, I want to talk to some other people in this group. I can email those. You can decide if you want to expose this kind of information or not. We also provide registration links. So maybe this isn't a public group, you need to know about it. You can share this private link with other people to say, hey, go through that registration. Maybe there's an approval involved in it to join this site. But the main thing I wanted to focus on there was the one-time passcode. So that ability to make it very easy to sign in and not worry about my password. So it was going to be this past March. They've pushed it back to October 2021, that one-time passcode feature will be on by default for all tenants. And basically these unmanaged Azure AD accounts, so if you've set your tenant up to use unmanaged accounts and not use the one-time passcode features, that's not going to be supported after October 2021. So that's only a couple months away. You got to be aware of that. I mean, we've been using it for about a year and a half. Very positive experience, lots of good feedback from that point of view. So I encourage you to if you're not already using it, turn it on. Don't wait for the deadline to come and just start going that way. It's something that your external users will appreciate. Okay, so let's move from there and into some of the other features. So we're going to go through the Azure AD external identities. The cool new things that they brought out here is self-service sign-up. So what we've done in our product that I just showed you there, you can actually do out of the box in Azure Active Directory as well. So I'll show you how you set that up and what that looks like. And then some lifecycle management around terms of use and access reviews. So let's actually start with the self-service sign-up. Before I get into the details, I actually want to walk you through what that looks like. So let me come back to, did my in private window go? Too many windows going on here. Okay, I'm going to shut this one down so I can start a new in private session. So I'm coming in clean. And I'm going to use a different site here. We've created this AAD self-register site. It's just an Azure app service that's running that we've set up as an endpoint to come to that has this self-service sign-up flow associated with it. And I'll explain how those pieces fit together in a minute. Okay, so I've hit that site and it immediately says, hey, I need you to log in. So we've got the out-of-the-box Microsoft login form. You can see that we've put our branding on that. So that's something you can do in Azure Active Directory is apply your own background and logo and such through here. So if I come in here and I say, hey, I'm going to use Peter 0727-9, so this is a new user, and try and sign in with that user, Microsoft's going to choke on that. It says, hey, that's not a valid user. So it's not quite as slick that we take you down that path, but it's not that bad. I hit this create one because I don't have an account. And I have a choice, hey, do I want to do it through email, with my Microsoft account, with Google? We haven't set up Facebook on this tenant, but we could have Facebook in there as well. Let's do the same path through sign up with email. Okay. So it remembers the account I was trying to sign in with, so that's nice. Good job, Microsoft. I hit next on here. And the first thing it wants to do is authenticate me. So before it even gets to the registration, let's capture your authentication information. So I'm going to grab the verification email that just came through. Just coming up here. You know what, I have it on my other screen in the preview window. I'm just going to give up on Outlook there. Let's paste that code in and go ahead and sign in. Okay, so I've now authenticated and I have to do the same consent that I was doing before. So this is still the Envision IT consent, same terms. Go ahead and accept that. Now I don't actually have an account yet, so it's now collecting the information to complete my registration. And I'll show you in a minute how we customize this form, what fields we want to capture. I've set first name and last name as required fields on here, so I'm going to have to go ahead and do that. And I meant to mention, Logan, if you don't mind, if you can put into the chat on the Q&A the link to this self-registration, people are welcome to try this themselves, and they'll actually go through the same experience that I'm going through here at the same time. and leave the other fields blank for now. Go ahead and continue that. So now it's creating my account. And Microsoft has a terms of use here. So I've set that up and I've said, hey, I've uploaded a sample doc here with what our terms of use are that I need to expand, review, and accept. I'm going to come back to that in a minute in more detail. Once I've accepted that, I should have to do one more consent because now I'm going to this application that we published, this original path that I was trying to go to. I need to consent into that application as well. It's showing unverified because we haven't gone through the verification process. That's something you want to do so you don't scare users off as to why they're getting this consent here. I'll go ahead and accept that. Okay, so now I'm into my application. So I'm going to talk about this in a later session. I kind of want to pause the demo there because we've already covered a bunch of topics and take you through a little more detail on what those are. Okay, so let's start with just a quick overview of the flow that we just went through. So we started by trying to hit our app, and we got the Microsoft login form. We said, hey, we want to create an account. We want to do it through email. We got the one-time passcode with the email that came to us. We had to consent to the tenant. We did our registration information, and then we had to consent to the app. Once I hit accept here, there was the terms and conditions, and then I'm into the app from there. So that's kind of the flow that we went through there. And this is the area here, the add more details that I want to dive into and say, okay, what can we do to customize and tune that? Well, the first thing is that we can decide what attributes do we want to capture. So, what user information do we want to bring in, any sort of custom attributes, assigning those to a flow, defining a page layout. We'll take you through each of those steps as we go through. So the first thing is to define the list of attributes that we want to capture. And we can see that most of these are built in. This one here, the supplier number, is custom. So you can add attributes, which can be string, they can be integers, they can be Boolean, like yes, no values. Now the strings can be drop downs. So things like the country we saw on the dialog actually had a drop down. I'll show you where that gets set up in a second. So once we've defined the attributes, what we do is assign those attributes to a user flow. And I'll explain user flows are connected to applications, which is that website that we were going to. So I decided, hey, let's not capture all of the things. Let's leave the supplier number and the display name off of the user attributes for this particular application. You can have multiple different user flows for different applications. And then we have to define the page layout. How do we want to show it to the user? What's the order that we want to have the fields come in? And this is where you do things like making something a dropdown. Okay, so let's actually have a look at that in the Azure portal. So if I come back here, if I start at the beginning and I say, okay, I'm at the top of my Azure portal, I go into Azure Active Directory. And it's this external identity section here that we want to focus on. This is where all the new features are around this. So I click on that. One caveat I won't show you, but if you try and bookmark links in here in different spots, we found that this is still a little rough edges. If you refresh your browser or you use bookmark pages, it doesn't work properly. You have to start back at the top and navigate your way through there. Okay, so let's start with the custom user attributes. So this is the full list of attributes that are available to any of the flows that are defined for this tenant. So you basically have to have all the possible fields in here. There's a custom one. If we want to add a new one, I can hit add here. I can give it a name and say, hey, it's either a string, a Boolean, or an int value. And maybe I want to put a description that shows up as a tooltip as part of that. So I've defined my list of attributes. And then what I have to do is associate those with a user flow. So user flows, we've got one here that I've set up. I've just got a single user flow in here. The first thing to remember with user flows is they're associated with applications. And sorry if this gets confusing, there's a lot of moving pieces to figure out through here, but this Azure Registrations app, this is this application that we built here. So we've created an app service in Azure, and we've registered this application in Azure Active Directory as an app, and that lights it up in here so that we can choose it from our list of apps and associate it with the user flow. And what that means is when somebody tries to go to this app and they go to sign in, they get that create on the sign in, and that comes into this user flow. That's all the moving pieces fit together from that point of view. So we associated our app with this user flow, and now what we do is say, hey, I want to look at the user attributes. So here's our full list of attributes that we defined, and you can see a couple of them I have unchecked in here. So if you want to simplify your registration form, you could uncheck a number of things through here and say, hey, maybe we don't want to collect all that information. We just want to know the country, the given name, surname, and emails are required as part of that. So now we have a much simpler form. It's up to you how you want to do that. Let me discard those changes though. And once you've defined your list of attributes for this particular flow, then you come into the page layouts and say, how do I want to lay that out on the registration form? So we don't see all the attributes. We only see the ones we have check marks for. And we can say, are these optional or required? So given name and surname, I've said, hey, let's make those required, which means optional is no. And all the other ones are optional, yes, meaning people don't need to fill those out. You can assign your own labels. So if you don't want to use given name and surname, you could remap those to first name, last name is what I put in through there. Most of these I left generally as they were through there. Okay, so now we've got our layout through there. You can actually make this multilingual as well. So we can say, hey, let's come into the languages section. And what I can do is I can have a look at the English template here. So I can actually download what's there already, or the overrides. The overrides are what I manually put in for English through there. So this is going to get a JSON file for me. Let me just pull that open here for a sec. And remember, I changed the label for country, first name, and last name. So because I modified those in the portal, they end up in this schema here. And basically, you can make copies of these files. Now you'd want the entire set for other languages, and you would map different languages to those. So if somebody came in French, for example, we're in Canada, bilingual is important, premier nom rather than first name, you'd provide that mapping in there, and then your registration form would be in both English and French. So done a nice job of providing that full multilingual interface through there. So that's how we set up those user attributes. As I mentioned, there's a number of steps you need to go through to wire that together, but basically you end up with that customized registration form as part of that. Now, the next piece you can customize is the approval workflows. Let's say you want to do something special either before or after that registration form comes in. There's actually two, they're kind of like webhooks, two places that you can connect out to an outside API, one before the federation has happened. So when I went through and I did the one-time passcode authentication, but I hadn't seen the registration form yet, that's the point that this first workflow would come up. And then when I hit submit on that registration, but before it actually creates the user, the second workflow can get called from there. And you can do special things in there to say, hey, let's validate, maybe that supplier number needs to match something that I've got in my ERP system, and I want to do a call out to SAP to validate that, to make sure it matches the company and the person that's trying to self-register. And if it doesn't, I could fail that out and present an error message back to the user saying, hey, you're not allowed to register, that's not a valid supplier number. It's up to you how your business processes are going to work through there. You can also have approval processes in there to say, hey, before we create the user, somebody's got to sign off and approve for that. So there's a number of ways that you can build those API connectors. They have GitHub samples for C#, Node, Python samples for that. The one they're missing that I would prefer to see is to actually use Logic Apps, because it's a workflow engine. It makes perfect sense to do that. And it can be exposed as an API. I gave a talk on secure development back in the winter, springtime that talked about this model. Basically, you would create a logic app that's triggered off of an API call, and then you would use that as the configuration in here. The only challenge is that when you're setting up these API connectors, there's a couple of ways that you can configure them from an authentication, either using basic or certificate. These don't actually work with Logic Apps. Logic Apps doesn't understand that method of authentication. So you have to use something like Azure API Management, which is a layer that you can put in front of the Logic app, and it would handle the security. So it would do this authentication with the user flow, and then it would call the Logic app to do the work from there. Nice thing being, once you've done that, it's very easy to customize those workflows inside a Logic app. You don't have to write code. You're basically pulling toward connectors together to make those decisions. That all happens in the same place. We've got our API connectors in here for this particular flow. I've just created one connection for this before creating user. It's actually a direct logic app. It doesn't work because I don't have that security piece in there. So what you have to do first is come back to the external identities level and define your API connectors. So this is where you add your new connectors and you define, what's the URL that gets called for that, what's its display name, how does its authentication work. So I've already got that before creating user one that you can see here is pointed to the logic app. And then once you're inside a user flow, you can say use that connector that I've defined in this particular user flow, and maybe you want to call it at the point that they've completed the registration and before the user gets created. So would like to have that all pulled together so you could actually see that in Logic App. I didn't quite get through the proof of concept far enough from that perspective. But you should get the idea there that there's a lot of flexibility and extensibility through this whole process. Okay, so let's switch gears now to terms of use. So we already saw this when we went through the demo with the one-time passcode. So when I was signing into the site, the page before I got to here was where I saw the terms of use and I had to accept that. So how did we set that up? What does that look like? Well, there's a couple of moving pieces here. So you define your terms of use in the external identities section, but they only get applied through a conditional access policy. So to use terms of use, you have to have Azure AD Premium Plan 1 at a minimum, because that gives you the conditional access policies that you need to do to enforce the terms of use. So let's go through what that looks like. So if I come back to my external identities and I come down here in lifecycle to terms of use, and like I said before, Azure AD P1 is something I would encourage every tenant to have turned on. So you should have the licensing for that. You can bring 50,000 users a month in for free to use it. If you're doing external sharing, I'd strongly encourage you to look at setting up terms of use on your tenant. Regardless of whether you're using any of this other stuff, maybe you're just using OneDrive link sharing and things like that. This is an important feature to say, hey, we're forcing all of our external users to read, acknowledge, and accept a terms of use. And it's all audited, so I can see who's accepted it. In fact, I can look at the audit logs in here and see exactly when each person accepted that. So at 12:30 in my demo here, for some reason, sometimes it's using the username, sometimes it's using the object ID, but I could dig in and find exactly which user that was through there. In fact, I can see that I edited the terms of use just before the webinar. Bad on me, I didn't do a test drive to make sure it worked, but luckily I didn't break anything through there. So not just the people that are accepting it, but the people that are doing changes to it are all recorded from an audit point of view as well. So if I come back here and I say, hey, let's actually edit those terms. So the name, the display name, the requirement that they expand the terms of use. I can have different PDFs for different languages as part of that. I can update my terms of use. So if I change it, we've updated our terms of use, I can actually require a re-accept to say, hey, with this new terms of use, regardless of whether you accepted the last one before, we need everybody to go through and re-accept those new terms of use. Because this is something you go through once you've accepted them, you don't have to go through it again from that point of view. Okay, so this defines the terms of use, but where do I actually apply them? And actually, there's a few features that you can't do on the edit side that you see when you do the new side. So just be aware of that when you create it, I'm not actually sure, maybe it's something you can do through PowerShell to get through some of these other additional features. The require users to expand was the one that we saw that was available there. You can also require consent on every device. That's something you wouldn't use with external users, because as soon as you turn that on, it's going to require the devices to be registered with Azure AD. You're not going to want to do that with your external users. You can have an expiry. So I mentioned it's something you go through once, but maybe you say, no, I want it to expire, on an annual basis or on a quarterly basis. You can define all those rules as part of that. And this is where the conditional access piece comes in. Basically what I did was I created a conditional access policy later and set that up. So let me take you over to that and show you what that looks like. So I need to come out of the external identities, come back to our Azure Active Directory, and come down into our security section. This is where conditional access policies are defined in general. So I click on conditional access. Normally you'd see a lot of different policies in here. This is our demo tenant, so we don't have much set up in there, but here's our terms of use conditional access policy. You can call it whatever you want. I called it the same name as our terms of use just to make it simple to understand. And under the users to include, what I did was I said, hey, let's select specific users and groups and make it all guests and external users. So anybody who's external to our organization is going to have to go through this conditional access policy. Now, I've only applied it to the one registrations app that we had. I could say, you know what, apply it to all cloud apps. I'll get a warning here saying, hey, make sure you don't lock yourself out as an administrator. That's sort of a general thing. There's some best practices around how you set up conditional access policies and how you have some emergency accounts, because you can actually lock yourself out of your tenant if you don't set these up properly, not for terms of use, but for other things like multi-factor authentication. And what controls do we have on this particular policy? Well, the only control that we've applied in here is that terms of use is there. So because I define that terms of use over in the external identity feature, it shows up here in conditional access and says, hey, we require that control. If I was doing a couple of other things, I would probably switch this to all the selected controls, because I'd want to ensure that maybe we wanted to require MFA and require terms of use, and both of those things need to do through there. So you can get quite granular with how you build these rules out. But that's basically how you set up your terms of use to come in for your guest users. And like I said, if you've got Azure AD B2B, this is something you can set up regardless of whether you use any of the other features that we're talking about through here. Okay. So our last big section that we're going to touch on here is called entitlement management. Now, this is an Azure AD Premium Plan 2 feature. So you need the higher tier of Azure AD in order to use this. And the idea is you create what are called access packages, and you can package up things like groups that people should belong to, apps they should have access to, SharePoint sites that they have access to. You know, it could be for your internal users, your external users. It's a nice way to onboard people, and it's something that you can use internally as well to say, hey, when I have a new hire, you know, here's different types of access packages for different types of users that give them the right things through there. You know, put them in the right teams, put them in the right SharePoint sites, and such from there. So it can become part of a much broader identity access management protocol for your organization. But specific to external users, it's something handy you can use to say, hey, I can put people into security groups, I can put them into Microsoft 365 groups, add them to teams, add them to SharePoint sites, you know, do a bunch of different things based on that access package. And you can define policies as to who can request them, who approves them, how long do they have access for through there. So there's a process you go through, but let's actually flip over into the live demo side. So if I come back to Envision IT, and now we want to come into identity governance is where we find the access packages. And let's have a look at the access packages that we have predefined. So I've got one here already for this group called the public group with approval. It's a slightly different group than the one I showed in the initial demo. It's intended to require approval as you go through, which is something that the access package does as well. So let's have a look at what's in that particular access package. So we can start with the resource roles. So this only has one resource role associated with it. Oh, wait a minute, what happened there? Huh. I had one in there before. I must have somehow deleted it as I was playing around. Let's go ahead and actually go through that. So the three main things I can do is put people in groups or teams, add applications for them, or add access directly to SharePoint sites as part of that. So let's do the groups and teams. So I can check this checkbox and see every group and team, not just what's in the general catalog as I add things. So I've done this public group with approval already. It's in the catalog, so it shows up in the list there. Let's just go ahead and pick that and select it and go ahead and add that. I could have multiple things in here, so it's not one particular thing. Oh, and I have to pick the role. I don't want to make them owners, I want to make them members of that group. Go ahead and add that. Okay, so now I've got that resource role defined in that access package. So what are some of the policies around this? So there's an initial policy that says, hey, anybody can request access, including new external users. So this is important. So let's actually go in and edit this. Hang on a sec. So because we want to use this in conjunction with the self-service sign up, we've got the name on it. Let's just come into the requests. So it allows users not in your directory, so external users, to come in. You could have a package just for your staff as well if you wanted. And for users not in your directory, there's this concept of connected organizations. So you can define specific organizations that you want to collaborate with and connect them and define them and say this package is just for those organizations. Or it could be for all configured connected organizations. I've left this wide open, which includes any new external users. So the self-service sign-up will work with that. Now, I can't do a no approval access package in this scenario. Microsoft doesn't let you do that. I have to choose a specific or all configured connected organizations, and then I have the option to turn approval off or on. For safety reasons, I don't entirely agree with this. I think there's scenarios where maybe you would want any new user to be able to join a group that doesn't require approval. If it's a very public type of concept to that. But whatever, they've made that decision to say that's not allowed through there. And there's a number of things, how many stages are you going to go through? Do you have to require justification? Who are the approvers? I've set myself as an approver through here. How many days do I have to approve that? Do I need to provide justification? There's a lot of granular controls through there. I can have alternates and such through that. And I want it to be enabled. And then from a requester information, do I want to collect some information? So this is not the self sign up form. This is specific to the access package. And maybe you've got specific questions that I want to capture as part of this that could drive the decision around approval, or you could capture this as part of a further workflow to go beyond that. And do these expire after a number of days? So this is set for a 1-year expiration. And do we require access reviews? And I'll talk more about that in a minute. So I think I need to save this because I changed. Oh, no, I didn't. I'm just going to discard this for now. Because I already added the new group through there, so we've got that. The separation of duties gets a little more complicated where you can say, hey, if you've got this package, you're not allowed to have that package. That's probably more for internal purposes. And I can see requests that have come in through there. So I've done some dry runs through here. So let's actually take that scenario. So let's come back to this app that we had here. So when I create an access package, let's see up at the overview, there's actually a link that gets created, which is how you request this package. So I could copy that to clipboard and email it to somebody. But what we did instead was we actually baked it into this app. So when people went through the self-registration, they've come in and they're signed in, they can now request that access package just through a link through here. So I'm going to go ahead and click on that link. So it's loading up that package for me. So all the things that I defined when I was defining that package appear here. I have to put in some sort of business justification on that, and I'll leave the period open and go ahead and submit that. So it is with approval. So I've now requested this access package. Obviously approvals here won't show me anything because I'm not the approver, I'm the person requesting, but I can actually take that same URL. It's actually the same portal that gets used on the other side. So if I come back over to my signed in administrator here, who's the person I named as the approver, and I go to that approval spot in the portal, I get an email for this as well that'll take me there. It just takes a little while for that email to come through. There's my request. I can see the details around that if I want to. I can click it off and say, yep, go ahead and approve that. It requires me to put some sort of reason in there. I'll approve it. And whatever that package said to do, which in this case was to put somebody into a group, gets executed as part of that. So let's see how quick that goes through. If I come back to my groups over here, so that public group with approval was the one that we set up in the access package. So if I look at my members here, no, hasn't quite come through yet. I think the workflows take a little while sometimes to run through from that point of view. But let's come back over to the other user. I can see my request history here. Oh, it's still a status of delivering. So it's still in process there, but we should see that as approved fairly shortly through that process. And then whatever this access package gives me access to, I can then go into that. So, the important thing to take from this, if we come back to our deck here, if you dig into the documentation around the self-service sign-up, there's this big note here saying, it's hard to read because I've crossed it out there, but user flows can't be used for Microsoft apps like SharePoint or Teams. Well, they can be, though. It just takes a little bit of work on your side to tie the user flows together with the access packages. So basically what we did was we built a very simple little website here that was authenticated and registered as an app, so we could use that with the external identity user flow. And it's got the link that links to the access package, and that can then give you access to SharePoint sites, Teams, all sorts of things from that point of view. You still need something to come back to say, hey, what's the SharePoint site that I have access to? You'd have to build a little bit more custom around that. I mean, that's kind of what we build with our landing portal that we have over here. That gives you the idea of what groups do I belong to and groups that I can see and such through there. But not a ton of work to build that out yourself to tie those pieces together. Okay, so we've gone through the demo already on the entitlement package. What I want to do now, actually, before we get to the forms folder, there's one piece that I didn't get to on the deck side, but let's come back to our identity governance here. Or sorry, no, external identities. Too many places to go to in the Azure portal. We're going to look at the access reviews. The idea here is to build a policy that says, hey, I don't want to leave guest access open forever. If people aren't coming into my portal, I want to review those and make sure that they're appropriately being managed. So I can say, hey, I want to set up a policy for all groups with guest users, only for the guest users. I can decide who the reviews are, how often they happen. Let's say it's the group owner and it's going to be a quarterly review. And basically what's going to happen is they have to justify that those users should still be able to access that group, or whether they should deactivate those users or remove them from the tenant. And it can provide some help to that. It says, hey, if there hasn't been a sign-in with 30 days, provide that as a helper so they can make a better decision as to whether they should maintain that user or not from that perspective. We're planning on going a lot further than this with our Extranet User Manager product. I think we could provide a lot more decision help as to whether reviewers to come in. It's not just the sign-in, it's the activity within the group, I think, is important to bear into that. But this is a good start to say, hey, we're not just going to leave these guest accounts out there forever. We're going to make sure that they get reviewed and removed if they're not currently being used. So normally I would put the poll at the beginning, but there was a whole bunch of topics that we went through here. In fact, I've updated this list from the screenshot that I wasn't sure everybody was going to be familiar with the topics for. So Logan, if you want to paste out this bit.ly link into the Q&A, I'd love to get some feedback now that people hopefully understand the various different terms and get a sense of what those are. Maybe we'll have less not sure what this is and whether there's an interest investigating or actually actively using those features today. Because I'd love to understand how people are leveraging Azure AD B2B and which of these features maybe they're already using or are interested in using. From an upcoming webinars, we're going to get going back in September again, taking a bit of a break. I got a boat booked in BC's Sunshine Coast next week, so I'm looking forward to getting off the grid. So I will be offline from an internet, cell phone, VHF channel 16 if you want to reach me out on the West Coast, and we'll get updates as to what we're planning on doing in September out probably in August sometime. We do have an open role if people are interested. We're currently hiring for a content marketing specialist role. So if you're interested in that, check out our careers page on that side. And from there, thanks. So why don't I have a look? I haven't really taken a breath as we've gone through here. Logan, Eric, I don't know if we've got specific questions in the Q&A that we want to circle back on.
There are some good questions, Peter. So one from Isaac, our organization has been trying to create Teams channels for guests. I've been inviting them through the Microsoft 365 Admin Center. Several people reported being unable to receive the invitation or that they were unable to access the Teams channel once they received the email invite. Would inviting through Azure AD help with this? otherwise, any advice on getting guests into a Teams channel?
Yeah, not sure specifically. We're actually working through this with one of our clients right now where they're trying to get in as a guest into one of our SharePoint sites, and most of the people in the org can get in fine and one can't. And we've got a support ticket open with Microsoft as to what's there. I know there are some odd challenges in there. Sometimes it's a timing issue, but I'm assuming that you've tried it over an extended period of time. There's something called a forward sync process that happens in 365 where when a guest user gets created, it can take a few minutes to even a few hours before that propagates out to Teams and SharePoint and all the different products within the Microsoft 365 side. So, I'm certainly happy to dig deeper or to open up a support ticket with Microsoft. I don't have a specific answer to that one. Sorry.
Okay. Another one, what is the support for GDPR from self-service onboarding, specifically around the right to be forgotten after you've, say, signed in? Is there anything out of the box, or do we need to work with custom tagging and custom workflows with identity protection to get that lit up?
Yeah, I haven't seen anything from GDPR says as a guest, you should be able to ask to remove all record of you from the vendor that you're interacting with. And I haven't seen an out of the box for Microsoft to do that. I think you would have to build your own form and workflow process to do that. I mean, the tools are all there in Graph to from an API point of view to be able to automate that, and it'd be up to you whether you use Logic Apps or some other tool to build out that workflow.
Okay. And then a last one, Peter, from Mike. If an NDA is already in place, is it common practice to skip the terms of use, or would you recommend using the terms of use that you showed, even if an NDA was in place?
I mean, the NDAs are typically organizationally executed. You wouldn't execute that with each person. And from a compliance point of view, I think there's a good argument to say each individual from your partner companies that are coming in as guests should probably understand and accept the terms of use, because they themselves probably never saw the NDA and didn't see the terms around that. But I mean, that's more of a legal opinion, and I'm not a lawyer, so don't quote me for sure on that one.
Okay, that sounds good.
I think we're at just after 1 o'clock, so I want to thank everybody for joining us. If we missed any questions or you think of things out afterwards, by all means, email out. Logan, I guess we should have your email contact in the deck as well. Maybe we drop that in and it'll be available up on the event page when we send the follow-up too.
Sure.
Cool. Well, thanks everybody. Have a great rest of your day and enjoy the summer.